Good evening, everyone. Well, we're here on a very special night. I don't know whether Maxine knows the competition she's got tonight with the final of the State of Origin on, so congratulations to everyone for staying, and Maxine, it must show that you are important. My name's Carol Dickinson. I'm here tonight as Acting Vice-Chancellor for QUT. And in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today and acknowledge that they have always been teaching and learning lands. I wish to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging and the continuing role that they play in the QUT community. On behalf of our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Coldrake, who's unable to be here this evening, I am delighted to welcome international, interstate and Queensland visitors to QUT. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Maxine McKew, our distinguished keynote speaker. But before I do that, I want to mention the sponsors who have made possible this 2015 National Summit. They are the Australian Association for Research and Education, the Queensland Government Department of Education and Training, Springer Publishing and QUT, and we thank all of the sponsors for their generosity. As many of you will know, Maxine McKew's career spans both politics and journalism, and more lately, education. Maxine is also a great friend and supporter of QUT, who contributed as moderator to the early success of our Business Leaders Forum events, and more recently by advocating in the media for the Faculty of Education's Exceptional Teachers for Disadvantaged Schools program. In the 2007 federal election, Maxine, the giant slayer, won a spectacular victory against John Howard, winning the seat of Bennelong and becoming only the second candidate to defeat a sitting Australian Prime Minister in his constituency seat. There you go. In government, she was Parliamentary Secretary for Early Childhood and then for Infrastructure and Local Government. Of course, well before 2007, Maxine was a familiar face to ABC TV viewers. She anchored current affairs programs such as Lateline and the 7:30 Report, and also worked in the US as a foreign correspondent. Her achievements in journalism have been recognised by her peers, and she is a recipient of both Logie and Walkley Awards. More recently, as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, Maxine has worked in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Drawing on the school's research and expertise, Maxine is the author of a new book, Class Act, Ending the Education Wars, launched in 2014. In this, Maxine documents the transformation that is underway in classrooms around Australia and examines the strategies that are helping to lift academic performance, particularly in some of our most challenged schools. So Maxine is a most fitting evening keynote speaker for this National Summit of Student Engagement, Learning and Behaviour. Would you please welcome Maxine?
Thank you very much and good evening. Look, I don't know about the game tonight, but I am intensely aware that my presentation is what stands between you and a really good gin and tonic. So look, I will keep that in mind. Now, Carol, that's a very generous introduction, but look, the more astute of you will have noticed that that introduction was pretty thin on educational qualifications, and that would be because they are thin. But I have had this marvellous opportunity over the last couple of years of spending time as a fellow in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne and really having time to talk when they're there, not on planes, with people like John Hattie and Patrick Griffin, and importantly, to spend time in schools. And principals have been very, very generous in spending time with me. So what I've done in the book I published last year through MUP, Melbourne University Press, Class Act, which I'm going to talk about tonight, I've gone back to my journalistic skills, my narrative skills, to write about what I think is one of the biggest challenges in Australian education, and that is how we replicate success across what is now a very fragmented system, and how we reverse the decline in student performance. Now, while I'm in the mood for disclosure, I want to tell you as well that I had to leap over one very intimidating hurdle when I started researching this book. It wasn't in securing the Dean's imprimatur. It wasn't in getting an endorsement from David Gonski, which he did give, which was very generous of him. The scariest bit was in telling my 92-year-old mother, a teacher with over 40 years' experience in teaching in Queensland public schools, that I was writing a book about her profession. She said, with all the hauteur of a Lady Bracknell. She does that well. Make sure it's readable. Imagine my relief when, after publication, she gave it the thumbs up and then started passing it around her mates. Funny how mothers never lose their capacity to make you feel as if you're 10 years old again. But if you will indulge me, there is an interesting bit of family history that is connected with this fine institution, QUT, and it's part really of the evolving story of education in this state. At the start of World War II, my mother, Mary Rickards, there she is, isn't she lovely? As she was then, was among a privileged few who secured a scholarship for 1 year's training at the Old Queensland Teachers College. Now, from the 1920s, those of you know the history of this institution, from the 1920s up until 1942, the college was then housed in the Old Trades Hall building up at the top of Turbot Street. Now, unusually for the times, Mary had completed 12 years of schooling and passed her senior exams at All Hallows Convent. Now, she was fortunate in her timing. Queensland had been very, very slow to professionalise its teaching practice, and long after most states had abandoned pupil teaching, it was still a feature in Queensland. But by the late 1930s, when Mary was finishing her schooling, the resistance to a more academic approach was starting to break down. But there are a lot of other hurdles for a young woman who had an ambition to teach. 2/3 of the scholarships went to men, a bias that continued right up until the 1970s. Now, by all accounts, from what I've read and from Mary has told me, college was a very practical, utilitarian place. You know, no one was sitting around talking about Proust. You were there to work, with the emphasis on teacher practice, and with 3 days a week spent in the classroom. And in Mary's case, she was at Eagle Junction. I think it's interesting to see that 70 years later, there's now so much emphasis on the importance of quality supervised practicums. Now, at the end of the year's training, there was no ceremony, no graduation, just a letter in the post to tell you that you'd passed and to notify you of where you were being posted. And so to Tumaville. Anyone know where Tumaville is? Go to Toowoomba and keep going west. This is Mary with her charges. Now, Mary's the one in the middle. She hardly looks older than the oldest girl there, right? She was only 18 when she got there. I think this is the classic, one teacher bush school of the era. But actually, if you look closely, they were prosperous enough, and it's marked on that photo, on the photo here, that's the school hall over here. This is before the BER, right? They had a little school hall. Now, there was no teacher accommodation, so Mary was billeted with one of the locals. And to give you an idea of just how tiny this place is, the children in this photo, this is the whole school, represent about 3 different families. So imagine some of the difficulties there. If you look at the age range, who knows the developmental range? Here was Mary on her own, 1 year of teachers' college. Her lesson plans would have looked immaculate, just ready for the dreaded inspector to turn up. But I wonder, if she ever ended the day thinking, I'm really struggling to locate the proximal development of that girl there with the plaits, wonder if she'd done a Vygotsky. Anyway, something must have clicked because Mary eventually fled the bush, came back to Brisbane and taught at the Gap, and then for many years, until her retirement in 1983, she taught at both Runcorn and Mount Gravatt. Again, her timing was good. When she married my dad, she hit the infamous marriage bar and had to resign. But within a year, this is the days of, people like me, the baby boomers, crowded schools, the department was sending out begging letters asking married women to come back and teach. So that's exactly what she did. She never liked housework much, so she's back in the classroom. So with Mary's story, I think it's interesting. You can really see the way that female workforce participation has always been subject to the vagaries of economic and social planning. One of the happiest parts of this story concerns this institution and its emergence as a fully fledged university in the 1990s as QUT, of course incorporating then the old Kelvin Grove campus. In what I think was a lovely gesture, and 58 years after she completed her teacher training, Mary, along with many of her teaching mates, was recognised as a golden graduate. And I know from my talks with her and her mates, this is an alumni that is very proud of what they did. Their years of service, teaching for them is something that gave their lives definition and purpose. Interesting to me as well to see that this very proud professionalism sat alongside, I think it's fair to say, an almost state-sponsored anti-intellectualism that really went on for decades in Queensland. For many, I think this was, for many years, this was a place that was deeply suspicious of the idea of too much education. I'll just show you this. This is a headline from the 1940s, when the idea of raising the school age to 15, it was then 14, was first talked about. So you had politicians and industrialists, they all agreed that this would constitute a dangerous experiment. Again, way behind the other states. Now, it's certainly true, these are the war years, and there's an argument to say that, we want, every able-bodied person in service and all the rest of it. But it did have a legacy. It would be another, as you know, 60 years before the combined efforts of people like Anna Bligh and Peter Beattie adopted the southern equivalent of 13 years of compulsory schooling. But if we look at the wider national context, there has been a very, very big leap indeed in post-secondary education, particularly in the bachelor degree or higher. And we shouldn't be blasé about this because it's a very significant achievement. In 1970, when I finished Year 12, only 3 out of 100 working-age Australians had a degree. If you look at 2011 there, we've had an 8-fold increase. We're now 25 out of 100. And today, if we look at the post-secondary population, we've got 53% of all post-secondary students enrolled in a bachelor degree, and interestingly, a situation where women are now in the majority. And I think these figures mean a lot. Personal fulfilment and enrichment for the individuals, and a significant boost for the country's economic and social development. Now, that said, I often find myself in something of a quandary about education. To borrow from Dickens, I think it's the best of times and the worst of times. The age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. The optimist in me thrills to see stories like this, highlighting the solid representation of young women in the forthcoming International Science Olympiads. But let's hope it means that we start to reverse those figures that we know in the STEM subjects, where women are incredibly underrepresented. So I give that one a tick. Not so much this one. On the downside, I do wonder if we haven't disappeared down a very strange hole when I see, wait for it, academic writing like this. Now, face validity of interpreting performance on the tasks against the CPS construct is supported by comparing the most efficient, direct problem-solving path with examples of actual paths taken by pairs of collaborating students based on log streams of activity accompanied by simultaneous chat exchanges between students which demonstrate verbally their thinking processes. We need Dave up here to get through this. I don't know about you, but if you can understand that, then you're doing better than me, Gunga Din. You're not laughing, and you should be. Or perhaps you are weeping. This was written by 2 people with PhDs in education. Their native language is English. Between them, they have 50 years in elite educational institutions. Now, I don't think it's because I'm a non-academic that I have trouble with this. This kind of sloppiness just doesn't cut it. In a vastly altered labour market, where the growth is in non-routine cognitive work, employers are looking for people who can solve complex problems, who can communicate clearly and can collaborate with others. It's interesting, I often read the work of Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, and he writes on international affairs, but he's also someone who loves looking at future trends and the changes around the world. And he's talked to people like, the head of people operations at Google and places like this. And he came back, he wrote a great column about a year ago, and this is how he ended it. He said, "Your degree is not a proxy for your ability to do any job. The world now only the world only cares about and pays off on what you can do with what you know. And that better be about clarity, both in a written sense and in an oral sense." So, let me come to schools and whether or not we can say, I'll just flick that back, whether or not we can say that we provide a class act for all. Now, I don't want to catastrophise. The fact that so many overseas parents choose to place their children in our high schools suggests, I think, a very high level of confidence in Australian schooling. That said, our system is far from great and in many areas very patchy. We all know that the PISA results are flashing red in some key areas and that the international PEARLS data that records achievement among primary school children shows that Australia is in the middle of the OECD pack when it comes to reading and writing. In fact, we're ranking with countries like Bulgaria and Slovenia. When Jeff Masters from the ACER saw these figures, he said he'd never seen anything like it. There is also the PEARLS-related survey material, which is a depressing read. I'll just pick out one statistic. When asked, 45% of primary school children say they only read if they have to. That is a terrible indictment of what we're putting in front of children. I think it speaks to our collective failure as well to excite children about the world of discovery through reading. And how many universities, I wonder, can confidently say that their graduates from their education faculties enter the classroom with a sophisticated linguistic toolkit of the kind that can unlock the magic of English? I'm going to come back to that point. My overall argument in Class Act is that we have to learn from the best, and we do have some outstanding practice in our schools. What we need, I think, is a profession that constantly stresses the importance of this practice, that has impact, practice with impact, as well as a high level of collaboration and knowledge sharing. That is the key, I think, to getting a system-wide lift. Now, I know Bruce and Joe are here, and QUT's extension of their Exceptional Teachers for Disadvantaged Schools program is really one of the great initiatives that I put into this field. It's part of a suite of solutions that over time really should deliver big dividends. At the graduate school at Melbourne, where I am, we talk about clinical practice, and all teacher candidates have to undertake a clinical practice exam. Now, that's a demanding oral presentation, and students have to demonstrate through an actual case study the diagnostic assessment of a particular student's learning, an appropriate intervention, and then show the evaluation of that intervention. Now, Master of Teaching candidates tell me that the CPE scares the bejesus out of them, but they all agree that it is actually a real test of what they have learnt in their extended practicums. Now, to state the obvious, a Class Act for school students is heavily dependent on a Class Act teacher training system. And to put this as politely as possible, with over, and this is the figure that John Hattie quotes, I can't believe it, but anyway, 406 offerings around the country. Can you imagine that? Over 400 teacher training offerings. To say the least, there is huge variability. Professor Hattie, in his role as chair now of AITSL, is already signalling that the likes of the, let's say, the University of Whoopsie-Doo, that provides only online coursework, and students have to go and, get on the phone and line up their own practicums, that they are unlikely to get certification. So 5 years from now, I think we're looking at a figure that's, somewhat lower than 400. So there are some big changes coming. In the meantime, we can't wait for that. In the meantime, smart schools are getting on with it, and I'll talk about just a few of them. About a month ago, I was at a school, Cambria College, a very large comprehensive high school that's 50 k's or so down the Monash Freeway from the CBD in Melbourne. Now, this is a school that's had an impressive turnaround in about 6 years or so. Before the turnaround, the Year 12 results were an embarrassment. It was a chaotic place with a bad reputation and a revolving door of teachers. Now, interestingly, when I spoke to the principal, Michael Muscat, about this, he said, well, actually, a lot of problems, but one of the problems was we had too much innovation. We were doing too much stuff. It's a very different picture these days. Canberra is now among the state's top 25% of government high school performers. They've developed a rich curriculum, emphasised rigour in teaching practice, and developed some critical partnerships. One of them is with the selective and very high-performing Nossal High School, which is just up the road. Now, instead of seeing Nossal as a competitor, as some schools might, Canberra actively engages with them. They expose their students to Nossal's students, and in turn, they have Nossal's expert maths and science teachers also teaching in advanced classes at Canberra. That's the good news. The bad news is in the amount of resourcing and remedial work that is required to bring Canberra's lower secondary students up to speed so that they can actually cope with the complexities of high school work. Now, they do a great job with that. But consider what they're dealing with. Canberra takes students from about 4 different local feeder primary schools. And in the first year of high school, when they get to Canberra, they're looking, when they grade students, they're looking at about 7 years of variability among those students. 40% of more of those students have a Year 3 reading level. Numeracy is poor as well. Now, this is not a particularly low ICSEA area, nor are the suburbs around Canberra full of first settler families. So I came away from Canberra asking an obvious question. What's going on in those primary schools? How is it you can spend 7 years from prep to Year 6 and get to high school and not be ready to read, to learn? Now, one of the people I talk to a lot in Melbourne is Bruce Armstrong. He's the head of the Bastow Leadership Institute in Victoria. You might, if he hasn't been up here, you might want to get him up here sometime. He has a lot to say on this. He thinks actually the system in many cases is failing our primary teachers by sending too many of them into schools without the precise tools to help children become proficient readers. When you think of how many reports over the years that have been written about literacy and how much we have poured into literacy programs, it really would make you weep. Now, Misty O'Donoghue at the University of Canberra is someone I think who makes a great deal of sense on this as well. She says it's the programs that are actually the problem. That they may be fine for kids who already have the language to access the material, but that there are many children, she says, just sitting in those, those literacy circles with guided readers in front of them and not understanding a thing. Misty and Bruce are both profiled in my book, as is another bloke I'm going to mention, Dean Ashenden. Now, Dean has done many things in his life. He's been an education consultant. He's been an advisor to education ministers. I think he's one of the best education writers in the country. There's a lovely Swinburne publication called Inside. It's an online journal. Dean writes in there, so I recommend his pieces. He has a somewhat different explanation. He thinks it's the way work is organised in a typical school day. Now, when I interviewed Dean, he recalled the way things were years and years ago when he was a young teacher. And this is what he said. I taught a kid called Frank. Frank worked mainly by himself, mainly listening, not talking. He would have to take a problem given to him by me, his teacher, without having to work out the right way to tackle it. He would have to finish before he really got the hang of it. The feedback from me centred on what he got wrong, rather than how to take the next step. Then he would have to start something else before he was ready. As a result, he saw himself as a failure, as did his peers. Now, we can all say, gee, heaps of things have changed in, 30 years since Dean was in the classroom. But the question I think we have to ask ourselves still in 2015, with much smaller class sizes, all that we know about how to engage children, and all we know about the importance of meaningful feedback, the question is still, what kind of a day are those kids like Frank having? Keep in mind we're talking about, say, 50, 60% of the kids who are somewhere in the middle. Some get by. For others, it's just a case of enduring quiet misery. Now, Dean says the price we pay for this is self-evident. In primary schools, we have students who are not learning. In secondary schools, we have students who disengage completely. But in the schools that are systematically re-engineering the labour process around the core ideas of the student as agent and of learning as growth, these are, I would say, the class act schools. Now, you don't achieve this without thoughtful, creative leadership, and that is the story that really is at the heart of my book. If you go through the chapters, what leaps out at you is a very positive story of highly motivated school leaders who have a precise set of capabilities and are determined to make a difference. Now, the starting point, certainly for those who are teaching in low SES schools, is to leave behind the idea that there are some kids you just can't teach. All you can do is just feel sorry for them, and offer a bit of pastoral care. The leaders that I describe do not have any truck with that notion. Instead, they work as hard as they can at determining what it is their students already know. Then they target their lessons just above that, and then they keep challenging them and challenging and challenging. The first thing to stress is that these leaders are not Superman or Wonder Woman. Certainly, they are all driven by a very high sense of moral purpose, but they're leaders because of what they do and how they apply themselves. They all start by setting the bar high. They then develop a plan, and importantly, they find the resources to back that plan. They're people who push and push. They push themselves, their staff, and the system. They test the limits of their authority all the time. And it's not because of some ego trip, but it's because they want to address some significant educational deficits. Now, of course, this is a kind of leadership that nearly always means you're upending the status quo. You're saying this is not good enough. And that is unsettling. It's unsettling for a school community. And it can make you very, very unpopular. There'll be at least 6 or 12 months of people talking behind your back. So the other quality that is evident among effective leaders is that they have courage. They're courageous. They have the courage to say, if there's a better way, then we have an obligation to try. Now, that's been Jeff Metcalfe's approach at a terrific little school called Rosworth Primary. Now, that's in the Girraween area on the outskirts of Perth. And here's a tip. If you want to have a glimpse at what a full-service Scandinavian-style school might look like in Australia, have a look at their website, Rosworth Primary. It's one of the 6 schools that I write about. The physical assets of this place are amazing. They run the gamut. Well-supported playgroups that are in the centre of the school with beautiful grounds, lovely appointed and designed rooms. A dental clinic, and that's a dental clinic that's available for every young person up to the age of 17 within that area. As they say there, the effect on public health alone of that facility will be extraordinary. They have a child and parent centre, and they have, as I say, beautifully appointed classrooms and a state-of-the-art teaching observation room with a fully equipped studio. It really, as I say, is quite splendid. When I saw it for the first time, I was, of course, immediately reminded of what is said in the David Gonski's review when he and his co-panellists lamented as they looked at schools across Australia, in many cases the still dilapidated state of many of our public school buildings. The West has actually spent well during the boom years. The tap's being, turned off somewhat now, but they did spend wisely during the boom. Now, importantly, it's what Jeff Metcalfe has done with this newly designed Rosworth that has turned a once very, very unhappy place into a school that now picks up awards. When Metcalfe started at the school, no teaching was possible because the place was so damn violent. Teachers just hunkered down. In some cases, they were too frightened to get out of their cars in the morning. The playground, if such as can be called, had become a place for intra-family feuding. That's by the parents, not the children. My editors, when they saw this, they said, are you sure you're right here? I said, yeah, it was, there were fights among local parents. And for a long time, this was tolerated, not by Metcalfe. He put his own safety at risk by staring down the worst of the offenders and then setting new rules and enforcing them. Now, needless to say, a whole lot of things came together. The redesign of this school, a complete rebuilding really of 2 schools, meant that you could have clearly marked entrances and exits that were supervised. But the real revolution has been in the practice and the thinking of the school. Having spent plenty of time teaching in remote parts of Western Australia, Metcalfe was well acquainted with the effects of intergenerational unemployment. But at Girraween he encountered something else, and that was the limited horizons and the real sense of hopelessness among many urban families. And keep in mind, this is about, I guess, 35 minutes away from the Perth CBD, but for most of these families, a trip to the local supermarket is about it. The effect of this for the very young is all recorded in the AEDI data. Girraween has a higher proportion of young children starting school who are considered to be developmentally vulnerable, much higher than the state or national average. And it was this data, it's interesting, that was Jeff Metcalfe's starting point. Early intervention programs became a key priority, with the most promising this on-site playgroup run by a lady called Judy Warren. Now, Judy Warren was an academic from Edith Cowan University. Her expertise was in early learning, and she used to come to Girraween to, think about doing research projects. And after a while, she said to Jeff, "You know what? I can come here and run this program, and I can have far more effect here." And that's what she's doing. Judy grasped an essential for those who want to engineer social change: that it is one thing to hand out a brochure with some helpful parenting tips to a parent who's struggling, but it's quite another to sit down in the sandpit with a young mum and have a respectful but very direct conversation about what goes on at home. On a daily basis, Judy talks about the basics, the importance of routines for young children, a bath routine, a bed routine, a reading a book routine, and about taking the time to listen to children and not always be yelling at them. You think of the lessons that are contained in that. There's a powerful ambition at the heart of this to do everything possible to ensure that children who start life disadvantaged in every way are given alternative support so that they can make, hopefully, a successful, happy transition to the first years of school. Now, still, with all of this, Rosworth, the progress there is incremental. It's steady, incremental, not spectacular. But what they are trying to get over is the very real sense of social exclusion felt by parents who still bear the scars of their own crook schooling. One of the first things that Jeff Metcalfe had to overcome was parents who didn't want to have anything to do with the school because they felt that the teachers just looked down on them. That led to another big change: the way staff are recruited. Now, within the WA system, Rosworth is an IPS school, an independent public school, and that gives principals a lot of latitude with staff hires. Rosworth only recruits teachers who are aligned with the school's values and who have the professional skills that will move the school forward. And this is what Jeff said to me about recruitment. He said, "If you want to work here, don't bother putting in a generic application. We've definitely raised the bar on how we recruit. We make it abundantly clear we are a partnership school. We have a research classroom where we video teacher practice, where we are into full-on self-reflection, and where we expect people to be responsive to change. If you are not into that, go somewhere else." A couple of other things about Rosworth. I like this. They reject absolutes. Metworth goes with a mix of what works: explicit teaching, bit of old-fashioned skill and drill, but also a range of collaborative activities where children practice what they've learnt. Structure is important because there's not much structure in these children's lives at home, as well as a great deal of clarity around lesson planning. The school has a set, as I've said, the school has a set of critical partners, and they do it very, very well. Edith Cowan University, very important. The Smith family, and another terrific philanthropic group, the Fogarty Foundation. And as I discovered, and as you would know, no turnaround school does it on its own. The good news from this is that the lessons from the Rosworth turnaround are now the basis of a knowledge network whereby clusters of schools work together and share what they know. And as I say, that I think is the way we get systemic change, applying and adapting lessons across the system. Now, excuse me. In the time I've got left, I'm going to mention a very different school. It's true, as I say, I've written about 6 schools. 5 of them are low SES. because I consider this a very, very big challenge. But I was drawn to the Garran School, and here's why. Garran Primary in the ACT doesn't have to deal with chronic disadvantage or persistent failure. Garran is one of the most demonstrably successful schools in the country. And yes, it's always been up there because of who walks in the door, but its Pearls results, remember I mentioned those before, the Pearls international data, show that Garran outperforms other like schools because of what it does on behalf of every single student. Now, it was Dr. Sue Thompson from the Australian Council of Educational Research who pointed me in the direction of Garran because she'd looked at all the data. Now, keep in mind, back in 2011, when we got these results, we all got a bit of a shock because for primary level reading and writing, Australia was outperformed by nearly every other English-speaking country. Now, I know if you look at PISA, it shows we're still in the top 10, but the Pearls were showing us a very different picture, and it could be the canary in the cage. What was also striking in the Pearls data was that our best students were being outgunned as well. Now, many of you know this, but it's worth re-saying that Pearls is a much more exacting test than NAPLAN. Students are required to read longer texts, complete stories, in fact. Imagine that, a complete story. You know, you've got to turn the page and show a high proficiency when it comes to evaluating what they have read. Now, Garran is a standout because a breakdown of their Pearls data shows that not only do their best students outperform the best at other schools, but they are more successful at getting their low and middle performers up into the higher achieving bands. So at Garran, they lift everyone. Now, when you look at the survey material for Garran, it's no surprise to see that Garran students say the opposite of what I quoted before. They all, show a high level of enjoyment and enthusiasm in reading, ditto for their interest in maths and science. Now, this is not serendipity. Garran is doing some very deliberate things. I spent a lot of time with Nina Mccabe, who is, by the way, the ACT Teacher of the Year in 2012. She has become really the force behind these stellar results. Now, Garran, she told me, has always been a place that did great things, for the top 20%. Terrific. But as Nina said, they had spiky results for everybody else. So the school took a conscious decision to push the mainstream and apply the same teaching techniques that were benefiting the top achievers. Now, Nina has a phrase for this, and I love this. She says, our approach at Garran is to do a few things really well. And when I said to her, I said, what do you mean? She said, well, a lot of schools feel they've got to do the Christmas tree, Everything's pushed on schools. You have a bit of this, you put this bauble here, the fairy at the top, bit of this, but no, don't do that. We just do a few things really well. Now, hold on to your seats. What they do really well at Garran is to teach English. At Garran, children devour books, and in so doing, many are achieving that magic click in the brain that comes when they develop such a love of learning that they start to appreciate complexity and they start to make creative connections. Now, Nina's background is interesting. She started her professional career as a speech pathologist, so she was used to being around linguists. She then switched to education and still remembers her first year at the University of Canberra, where one of her lecturers, a stickler for grammar and good writing, initially failed 1/3 of the class. Imagine that. This lecturer had the extraordinary idea that without a mastery of one's native language, it was asking for trouble to send unprepared teachers into the classroom. The breakthrough moment, though, for Nina came a bit later when she began work on her master's and met up with Professor Misty O'Donoghue, who I've already mentioned, and someone who had become something of a soulmate to Nina. The two clicked, and it was Misty who suggested to Nina that her research could explore the way that quality children's literature can be used to lift children's interest in reading and to teach the foundations of grammar and sentence structure. Now, it's been an enduring partnership and one that has produced a methodology that is now attracting a lot of interest. It stresses the importance of rich, emotionally engaging literature for all children, not just for the bright ones, for all children, and using the work of good writers as the primary learning tool. Typically, students will examine how writers use language to create mood and meaning. And yes, there's plenty of explicit teaching along the way about things like adverbial phrases and active verbs. Now, needless to say, if you want to teach like this, you have to have a solid understanding of the language yourself. And I think we have really shortchanged a whole generation by ignoring this. The Garran experience, and it's been replicated in other schools where Misty now runs masterclasses with English teachers. The Garran experience shows that for children who don't start out speaking English as their first language, it's an approach that provides a great deal of clarity. And for more confident readers, it develops their critical literacy and opens up a whole world of subtlety and richness. What you won't find at Garran are all those workbooks that are now pushed on schools by educational publishers, whereby the students have to sit down and circle the nouns, circle the adjectives, completely meaningless according to people like Misty. They also at Garran avoid like the plague any talk of the NAPLAN standard. They don't talk about the standard anything. They believe in excellence. That's what they go for. Again, it's also a place where teachers who want to be lone rangers are discouraged. Garran requires rigour in teaching practice so that they can get consistency in student improvement. So, different schools, different stories, but at the heart of it, there's a common ethos, isn't there? A focus on success and a culture of no excuses. Resourcing that is precisely targeted, and school leadership that is animated by the idea of children's learning and well-being. I think our ambition should be such that whether it's a Year 3 student at Tummerville, if they've still got a little school there, or a Year 3 student in the Cape or over in Rosworth, that they actually grow up with the skills and the confidence to be able to compete with, the best of the engineering students that, I occasionally see at Lab 14 in the Carlton Connect program. You'll have to forgive the southern chauvinism in that analogy. I'm going to finish with a word or two about education policy. I've already mentioned John Hattie's work with the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership. That was a national body that was set up by Julia Gillard when she was Education Minister, and interestingly, one that Christopher Pyne has not demolished and in fact has embraced. Hattie has been given the job of implementing the recommendations of the TMAG inquiry, the Teaching Ministerial Advisory Group. The big one for providers of education degrees is this: a requirement on the part of the university to produce evidence that their graduates are capable of having a positive impact on students. Now, they're working out the metrics on that one at the moment. Easy to say, I know, but I suspect it will be tricky to implement. Now, I'm hardly an expert on this, but I would think that the work that is being done by QUT suggests it's already ahead of the game, with your focus on selecting high-impact teachers for disadvantaged areas. I think ditto for those institutions who track their graduates, and ones that have developed strong partnerships with a cluster of schools. My hope is certainly that over time, this is going to move us in the direction whereby universities are enrolling more students for whom teaching is a first and desirable choice. I'll just finish on this. The other major policy area, of course, is the funding of schools. The extra funding made possible by the Commonwealth National Partnership Agreements dating back to 2008 when I was in the Parliament, they've really been critical to certainly 5 of the 6 schools that I've written about. I also know that from my time working with Social Ventures Australia and the work, some of these schools that I travelled to and researched here in Queensland, again, that NP money was absolutely essential to helping principals work on some of the approaches that I've described tonight. But that stream of funding, as you know, has concluded or is being wound up. And the Gonski funding formula of a base resource for all schools with significant loadings for disadvantaged students, that was always meant to replace it. But as you know, any shred of bipartisanship on this has broken down. Across the states, it's a very patchy picture. I gather here in Queensland you've got your state budget coming up, so there'll perhaps be more clarity soon. But we've got the curious situation in Victoria, where a new Labor government has signed a funding agreement that many of us think is not compatible with Gonski principles, where a Conservative government in New South Wales has done the opposite and absolutely embraced Gonski 100%. We live in curious times. But here's the rub. Since Gonski's report came in at the beginning of 2012, the national fiscal situation has changed. We all know that. The big extra licks of money that Gonski envisaged may not be there. Now, that reality should force us back to how we are dividing the existing pie. That was something that was not on the table in 2012, but I think it's going to force us back there. I'll finish by offering some comparisons. Now, I'm always going to be grateful for the quite exceptional education that I had at All Hallows, certainly in my high school years. Primary was a bit ordinary. High school was terrific. It really set me up for life. But I had a look at the figures recently. On the latest figures, All Hallows' total funding per student is just over $19,000. That's pretty ordinary compared with private schools. You should know the Grammars would be up at $30,000. On NAPLAN rankings, All Hallows is among the nation's top 100 performing secondary schools. It comes in at number 70. It's also the top 50 girls' schools. It's in the top 50 of girls' schools. On the same list, right, the same list of the top 100, I could only find one Queensland public school, and that's the selective Brisbane State High. It came in at 75, which surprised me, but they have a total spend, this is the point, they have a total spend per pupil of $10,400. Now, on that index, a 5-point difference in rank costs close to $10,000. Now, to my mind, that raises two questions. Is this a cost-effective system? Is it fair? More concerning, I think, in terms of equity, particularly in Queensland, is the list of tables published which rank the least expensive schools. Now, I know ACARA doesn't do this, but the Australian did this recently. It was very, very interesting. You go down the list. This is right. This is the least expensive schools. You go down the list. 40 out of 50 are in this state. Overwhelmingly, they're public primary and low-fee Catholic schools. They're in the metros or the regions where the funding per pupil is around $8,500. The equivalents in Sydney and Melbourne attract about $9,000. Now, that suggests to me that Queensland, in some areas, and I know this is not true in the remote areas, but in some areas, Queensland's doing education on the cheap. When I looked at the list of the top 50 primary schools, 2 Queensland public schools make the cut. Ironside in St Lucia with a per-student funding figure of $9,300 and Fig Tree Pocket with a spend of $9,500. Now, we all know they are public schools in high SES areas. The only other Queensland primaries in the national top 50 are St Aidan's and St Peter's Lutheran College with a per-pupil spend of around $22,000, more than double. So you've got 4 schools, 4 primaries in the top 50. I have not gone through this exercise to reopen the class wars, but it certainly may suggest to you that there is a dual meaning in the title of my book. It is a fact that we have developed one of the most socially stratified schooling systems in the Western world. The question, I think, for all of us is the extent to which this is set in stone, or whether we can take heed from the really remarkable work of David Gonski and his team and make appropriate adjustments. Thank you.
So I did put notes onto my phone here and then saved it onto my home screen, but it's not working because there's too many Twitter feeds coming up, so I can't read it. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Maxine McKew for coming all the way up from Melbourne and for agreeing to conduct our evening keynote speech. Maxine was always a delight to work with and to engage. I would also like to thank our Vice-Chancellor for funding, sponsoring this event. It's not every day that you're able to send an email to a Vice-Chancellor, a very heartfelt, begging email, but it's not every day that you get an answer and a phone call. And I think actually that just, it's testament to why I came back to QUT. I did my PhD here, and I went down to Sydney, and I spent 6 years there. And I always wanted to come back. And the reason that I did is because education at QUT, I mean, we're one of the only faculties of education left in this country. And it's always been important. And for me, it was important to be here at a place where education is respected and cared about and looked after. So I would really like to thank him for that. And especially because we get to put on some beautiful red wine and white if you're into that. But so I would really like to encourage you all to join me in some drinks. And also I want to plug that tomorrow, you know, I've remembered some of my notes now. Maxine talked about diagnostic skills and abilities of teachers, and that is something that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow from the prep school prep year project that I'm doing, longitudinally tracking 215 Queensland prep children. And there are some really interesting findings from that research, and I do think that actually the Gonski funding, I want to see that because I think it will help. That there are, it's not just about identifying the children that need more help, because you know what? When we're sitting in there and observing in prep classrooms, I can see them a mile away. And I also know where a lot of them are going to end up. And that's in my other behaviour school project, and I don't want them to go there. So, yeah, go Gonski.